Welcome everyone to this series where we're exploring the philosophy of objectivism through different areas with some of the members of the Ayn Rand Institute. In this occasion, I am here with Onkar Ghate. Thank you very much for being here, Onkar. You're a senior fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute, and also Ben Bayer. Thank you very much for being here. You are a fellow and instructor at the Ayn Rand Institute, right? So we're going to talk about a little bit of free will, this concept that determines freedom, individuality, decision-making. Are we the owners of our own decisions, yes or no? And I would like also to explore a little bit on, like the debate of free will, how free are we or not. So for everyone joining us, this is an approximation that we're trying to do for you to understand different approaches of objectivism. In other parts of this series, we're discussing things like religion, beliefs, art, and all the approaches that this philosophy has to offer for your life. So I would like to start talking about what is free will. Isn't it also a concept that has been linked to religion as a thing that people use to justify the evil in the world, right? We've all heard that they say, oh, evil in the world is not because God is bad, it's because there's free will, and the humans, they decide to act wrongly about it.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there. So one is, what's the idea of free will? And then to think, do you need religion to have this idea or to ground this idea? I think the idea of free will is that the basic idea is that you have the power of choice. And that means that there's forks in the road, and you can choose which fork you're going to go. Am I going to go down this road or the road less taken, if you take the Robert Frost poem? And it's up to you, which means everything that came before, what in philosophy will be called all the antecedent factors, they're not what determine which road you take. You determine it in the moment by your choice. Mm-hmm. That's what, if you have free will, it means you have that power. Right. And then there's the issue, to have that power, you have to have some kind of religious view, that if you were just scientific and viewed the world as completely governed by natural causes, there would be no free will. And somehow it's religion injects this power into man, into the individual human being, and that's what then allows him, he could choose an evil path. But I think you have to disassociate those two ideas. You can have a view of free will, and certainly Ayn Rand has a view of free will that's natural, scientific, not at all religious.
Right.
One way this question sometimes comes up is because, and Onkar alluded to this, that the popular view is that free will would have to be something magical, it would have to be something supernatural. Many contemporary thinkers don't think it makes sense on a scientific worldview. But I would actually go a little further than what you were already suggesting, Onkar, and say that I don't think free will makes sense on a religious worldview. Okay. When you believe in a divine being who is allegedly all-powerful and all-knowing, and who created you and who created the entire universe, there's a serious question of, he's supposed to then know everything that you're going to do with your life. And he could stop you from doing it if he wanted to because he's all-powerful. So how is it that you still have free will in that kind of situation? And this is a problem that religious thinkers have grappled with for many years, because I think ordinary people have the conviction, and I think a good one, that they are in control of their life. And so there's then effort on the behalf of theologians to try to reconcile, how could someone actually have control of their life if there's this all-powerful being looking over them? And they come up with a variety of different devices and kind of rationalizations to reconcile those. I think they're all a big stretch, and I don't think really any of them work at the end of the day.
Right. I have here the paradox of Epicurus that says if God can prevent evil, but he's not capable, then he's not omnipotent. Now, if he's capable, but he doesn't desire to do it, then he is mean. Yeah. Now, if he's capable and he wishes to do it, well, where does evil come from? Now, if he's not capable and he doesn't wish to, why would we call him God? And this is Epicurus talking about not even the Christian God, like the
Right.
gods before. And that's the thing, like you were pointing out. If we have free will, then what's the role of the gods in, choosing our destiny?
And the way that the debate usually breaks down is that you either have to, somebody who's trying to reconcile it, they either have to take away some power that's popularly associated with God, like his foreknowledge or his all-powerful nature, or they have to water down the concept of free will. They have to take away the idea, for example, Onkar said it's like a forking path. They'll say, well, we don't really face a forking path, but we're free in the sense that we're doing what we want to do, even if God's the one who made us want to do it in the first place. And so it ends up watering down the idea of freedom, and it's not really what people think they have.
Okay.
And no, there's a real connection between the religious view and the scientific view. The scientific view says I can look at the antecedent factors and tell in advance, this is what you're going to do. And that means you don't really have a choice about it. If someone can tell before you're even doing anything, you're going to order steak at the restaurant, then it's not really a choice. It was determined by the antecedent factors. And the religious view says God can say what you're going to do. He's all-knowing, so
Right.
he can tell in advance, you're going to go to the restaurant at 7:28 and you're going to order chicken and you're going to spill your glass of water. And if all that's said in advance, what does it mean that you have any free will? And that's why religion, both views are saying you don't really have the power of choice.
Right.
There's another twist on that, which is that both of those views, both the religious view and the sort of materialistic view, there's a kind of faith that there's actually some way of knowing that. I mean, obviously, with the religious view, you have to believe that God exists and that he has all these powers. But even with the allegedly scientific view, there's this conviction, well, we'll have to be able to predict people's decisions. Now, in fact, nobody's ever done it.
Right.
And all the evidence that's been collected so far suggests that there's certain parts of our life that we just can't explain without reference to choice.
Now, the fact that we have free will evidently makes us the main characters in our lives, right? We are not depending on what our parents, our friends, our politicians decide for us. It's eventually us and our ability to be responsible for the outcomes of the own choices that we make, right?
Well, it depends, though. It depends what your view of free will is.
Okay.
So there's two issues. One, do you think we're completely determined? Or do you think we have the power of free will? But the second issue is, what exactly is that power? See, Ayn Rand has a very distinctive view, and it's a view that says, yes, you are in charge of your life in a very fundamental sense. But it's because she has an account of what the power of choice involves. So if you really thought of choice as just, I can decide what clothes I'm going to wear in the morning. I'm going to put on my blue short or my green short, which I put on. And I can decide what I'm going to order at the restaurant. And if that's all choice is about, how does that put you fundamentally in control of your life? But she didn't think of choice as like that's the fundamental, those kinds of choices.
Okay.
And particularly so it's not about these kind of particular choices of content. Am I going to order steak or chicken at a restaurant? It's rather you have a control over your mind and your mind's functioning. And one of the ways she puts free will is you have a choice as the sort of, what's your basic choice? You have a choice to think or not. And that means you can set your mind in motion. You can decide to think, to deliberate about something, to consider all the information that you can gather. You can go on the pursuit of more evidence to figure out what I should do. And that's where your ideas come from, and then your emotions and your character. So it puts you, her view is that you have fundamental control, but it's not only because you have the power of choice, it's that you have this fundamental power over the functioning of your mind.
Right. Now, understanding that still the brain is like a muscle, right? The more you train it, the more prepared it is to make better decisions. For instance, if someone has never read more than 50 pages in a book, it is evident that reading a novel like Atlas Shrugged will take that person way more time and way more effort than someone who has read 1,000 books in their life, right? The brain gets used to the training that you give it, right? If you expose it to more intellectual conversations, to better books, to art, then your brain will develop capacities of understanding reality better than people who are never exposed to those things and just like stay in their own bubble of like mentality, right? Given this, and we know that, for example, we can train our brain to have better memory, we can train our brain to develop better reading comprehension, we can train our brain to develop courage, right? If you constantly are challenging yourself into conquering little fears, like for example, if you are afraid of talking to strangers, but you constantly push yourself to do so, you will eventually conquer that fear.
Yeah, but I wouldn't put it as you train your brain.
Okay.
I think you acquire a whole bunch of knowledge and a whole bunch of ideas that you then store in your mind. And that then plays out in your life as you're living it. So I mean, take a simple example. And Ayn Rand called this, it's a process of automatizing that at first requires a lot of conscious, deliberate focus and thinking, and then it gets stored in your subconscious or in your mind. I mean, think of when you were learning mathematics. You're learning addition, subtraction, division. It was hard at the start, and you have to really sit down and figure it out. And now, like, what's 4 times 5? Comes to mind automatically, 20. And that, so you could call that training your brain, but I think what it is, you're absorbing knowledge, and then that knowledge is available in new situations as you're dealing with them. And it allows you to focus on something new because there's so many things now that are automatic that come to you.
Like the performance of last night of Siriano, that the actors were saying, right? That it comes like automatic.
Yeah,
but I wasn't there because I was training my brain for this interview.
Oh, you were?
How's it going so far? Was the training good?
Yeah. I wanted to add something to that, which is that part of the way that you raised the question was you talked about exposing the brain to certain kinds of environments, certain kinds of music, and I mean, I wanted to get on board with what most of you were saying, but it's important, I think, that you could have two people in the same situation. They're exposed to the same influences, they hear the same ideas, they hear the same music, whichever you want. But what free will really means is that those people can choose to process that differently. Some people are going to listen to what's being said, they're going to think about whether they agree with it, whether it makes sense to them before they accept it or reject it. Others maybe are just going to passively absorb it. And I mean, part of the reason why people find the idea of determinism plausible, why they're skeptical of the idea of free will, is because there are a lot of people out there who, when they're exposed to certain things, just do passively absorb it. And as a result, they end up kind of acting as if they were determined.
So they choose to passively absorb it. They choose not to. So she put it the choice to think or not to think.
Right.
So if they choose not to think, then they are much more a product of their environment. But it's not determined that they're a product.
That's why she always said that you can ignore reality, but you cannot ignore the consequences of ignoring reality, right? Eventually, it will get caught up, and this is what I see in Latin America. People deliberately choose to ignore the realities of economics and of history, which teach us that communism and socialism doesn't work. They decide to ignore it. They try one more time, and again, the result is misery and hunger and poverty, right? It's like a...
Yeah, and that's an important point, because her view that it's a choice to think or not to think, the not to think includes two things. Part of what Ben was bringing up, it's you might just passively, I'm not thinking about this, I'm not exerting any energy, effort, I'm just sitting back, and this is what's hitting me, and I absorb some of it, and I don't. That's a very passive process. But there's a process that she calls evasion, which is you actively work not to see. You don't want to face reality. You don't want to face the consequences. You want to have super high taxes and don't want to think about, well, can we really pay for this? What's this going to do in a year from now? Is it going to bankrupt our country?
Right.
Where you push that out of mind. I don't want to see this. And maybe you tell yourself, like a Keynesian, well, the long run doesn't matter.
Exactly.
And so you give yourself a rationalization that enables you to push it out of mind, and she calls that evasion. And it's important that the choice to think or not to think includes both. You can be really passive, or you can be actively avoiding reality.
Right.
Interestingly, I think she would also say that denying the existence of free will itself works as an evasion, because people will use it to rationalize the terrible things they've done. They'll say, I couldn't help it. Or they'll say, we're all sinners. We live in an imperfect world.
Right. Now, with all this context, can we really take credit for our own personality and our own decisions? How much of our personality can be product of our genetics or the things that we already have? Now, I would love to bring Ayn Rand to the 21st century. Now that
I'd like to meet her.
Right, yeah, and like expose her to like, like different debates that we now have. And one of the things that will intrigue me is, that now you can test your DNA to know your ancestry and also like your health. And they can, tell you if you are if you have in your genetics the probabilities of getting cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer or Parkinson's. And we are learning that in the genetic process, we not only inherit like the color of our eyes from our parents, but that sexuality, for example, our sexual desires are also something that come, it's not like the religious views thought before that, oh my God, these are sinners that go anti-nature. No, it turns out that it is part of the nature of the human being, the diversity in sexuality. We now know these things, but we still don't know how much of that determines our character, our personality. And I know that in recent books, Steven Pinker is almost saying that free will doesn't exist, which actually contradicts things that he wrote here in The Blank Slate, right? Because in this book, for example, he starts saying, this is not going to be one of those books that says that everything is genetic, because it isn't. The environment is just as important as the genes. The things children experience while they're growing up are just as important as the things they're born with. But I think that the problem that we're now facing, and which I would like, for Ayn Rand to be here and tell us, is that we cannot really categorize which things are those that could be genetically, passed from your parents. For example, propensity to adrenaline. Chemically, there are more people propense to adrenaline rushes, and that makes them more propense to be drug addicts or casino players or to jump from parachutes, whereas there are people that know, or even cheaters in their love relationships, right? And they might take irrational decisions because of that. Now, I am not a determinist. I do not believe that genes will determine our destiny, because that's like, right, like thinking of a God that it's already making the decisions for us. But I am really intrigued in the findings that our DNA can teach us, not only of the diseases, but also mentally. So what would Ayn Rand say about, are we all blank slates? Do we inherit certain personality traits from our parents?
So there's, I have a friend who does research in psychology, and she brought to my attention some work that's been done recently by other psychologists in the field of what they call behavioral genetics.
Right.
And one of the things that they usually like to study, and it's kind of the gold standard for questions, studying questions like this, is twin studies. So you take some twins, identical twins, who obviously have pretty much the same genetics, and who, in most cases, were actually raised by the same parents in the same environment. So you're holding fixed both genetics and environmental influences.
Right.
And the interesting thing about a lot of these studies is that there are still things that identical twins, even when they're raised in the same circumstances, will end up doing differently from each other. They'll end up making different choices from each other. And some scientists have actually figured out ways of quantifying how much of the differences between the two of them you can account for using either genetic or some other environmental differences that might exist between the two of them. There's a paper from year 2000 by Turkheimer and Waldron, which is important on this. But what they found is that something like 40 to 60% of the differences that you find between identical twins in regard to behavior traits, character traits and behavioral differences, there's no way of accounting for by reference to either genetics or environment. Turkheimer says if you're going to look for free will, it's in this what he calls non-shared environment where it's going to be. And he says leave it to the philosophers to figure out what free will is and what it means, but there's certainly nothing in current behavioral genetics that allows us to explain all of the differences between individuals in this regard.
Right.
And the idea of a blank slate, I think one has to be careful and distinguish two things, and I don't think in Steven Pinker's book, these are distinguished very well, and really they're run together. So you can talk about a blank slate, and this, I think in philosophy what is meant, and this is what Ayn Rand means when she talks about that you are tabula rasa, which is the Latin for a blank slate.
Yep.
It's that there's no content in your mind prior to your senses, and then your thinking process is working. So you're not born with any ideas. So there used to be a view in philosophy that you have innate ideas, so that you somehow inherit, or at birth you have content in your mind. And she's rejecting that, and I think rightly she's rejecting that your mind starts working and you become conscious only when your senses start working. And prior to that, there's no content in your mind. But so to say that is not the same as saying, so the other kind of view that blank slate often means is there's no innate structure. There's no identity in the end. Your mind has no nature. It's
silly putty is what he compares.
Yes, yeah. And that's trying to get, it has no characteristics, it has no structure. All that comes after birth, and that's not true. And Ayn Rand did not think that is true at all. She compared the mind at birth to like a complex camera. So it has a real structure, it has all kinds of capacities or potentialities. But for that to become active, you need the actual experience to start happening. But I mean, parents report from very early on at birth that different kids have different moods and different temperaments. That's not the same as saying they have different content or they were born with some different content. It's just they respond to their experiences in a different way. And it might be because there's differences in adrenaline. There can be, I think that's a scientific question to then investigate all
because you say we don't have inherent ideas. For example, no kid is born believing in a God. That is something that is inputted.
Yes.
But are we born with certain moods, or are we born with certain talents or characteristics that will differentiate us in the long run into becoming a piano player or a medicine doctor? Does she make any differentiation in between having certain talents that could come from what your parents or your grandparents did before? Like, for example, can you tell, like, if you come from a family where there are actors or actresses, and then the kids also go into that business road, you can never tell, was it the environment that they were exposed to or not, right?
I think it's really important what Onkar said before about how Ayn Rand's view of what free will is very distinctive, and that what she thinks we have control over is whether we are going to engage in active reality-oriented cognition or not. And that's it's certainly not the view that we have direct control over everything in our life. We're obviously born with a lot that's out of our control, who our parents were, where they're from, what their physical characteristics were. And I mean, it's an interesting open question, I think, of whether certain kinds of personality traits, tendencies to have certain kinds of mood fall into that or not. What's important is what you do with that. And in one of the papers by my friend who's a psychologist, she gives a really interesting example here. So imagine you have a couple of identical twins, and for whatever reason, some combination of their genetics and their upbringing up until that point have made it such that they're both disposed to get particularly angry in certain situations. So she imagines both of the twins being berated by a teacher, let's say, and they're both tempted to lash out against the teacher. And maybe up until this time, that disposition is not something they can control. Well, but even still, they have the choice to think about whether it's a good idea to react in that way or not. And they both probably have some glimmer of the notion that if they were to act out, the consequences wouldn't be too good. But let's say one of them, it occurs to her, but she ignores it and goes ahead and lashes out, and then she's punished, and then she has to come up with new rationalizations for why she's being mistreated, versus the other who's similarly tempted, but who takes enough time to realize, wait, if I do that, it's going to be worse than if I don't. and figures out a way to handle it better. Now you can imagine those two twins starting from a very similar place in life, but ending up on very different paths, especially because each choice they make ends up, exercising their brain differently in one direction or another, and they end up developing different kinds of character, different kinds of personality in the long run because of that, even if they start in the same place.
Now, in that context where I completely agree, I mean, at the end is, okay, you're given a certain pool of genes and choices that you didn't make, who are your parents, where are you growing up, but at the end, it's the decisions that you make along the run that will determine who you are. Now, knowing that, there are certain ideas that support some of the deterministic views. For example, the noble savage, right? The noble savage is something that Pinker addresses here, and he actually looks at it as a negative thing because it has justified the creation of socialism. For example, the imagining this amazing paradise where the primitive human was free of an environment that makes him evil or violent, and we have to go back to that noble savage era. And the other is the ghost in the machine, right? You are not in control, but there's like the ghost in the machine. Why would Ayn Rand, how would she approach these two visions?
Well, I think that a lot of what Pinker says in that book, by way of critiquing something like the noble savage view, I think is pretty good. I mean, what the noble savage view is a version of the idea that we all start out without any kind of character, and then civilization pressures us and imprints some kind of wickedness in our heart, and that's why people do bad things. And so, to the extent that he's criticizing that idea, I think he's on good footing, because part of what he's doing there is he's criticizing a kind of environmental determinism.
Yeah.
My problem with him is that he then thinks, well, it's just genetic. Whatever's left over is just genetic. He thinks it's either nature or nurture, and that there's not a third option. That no, sometimes we're the ones who are in charge, and it's neither our environment nor our ancestors.
Right.
And the idea of the ghost in the machine, I mean, really comes back to the issue of free will. It's a little bit wider than that. He calls it, sort of, without using the metaphor, it's dualism. But this is the idea that the mind is, in the end, that it's supernatural. That consciousness is supernatural, and particularly free will. So it's putting it on the side of religion, that if you were following natural causes and science, you would have to view a human being as determined. He has no power of choice. He doesn't have selection between alternatives. He can't take different forks in the road. And what free will is a non-causal power, or it's the power to override the causes of science. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, he views it as, well, this is a mystical, religious view. It's a ghost. So a ghost is like a supernatural thing who's in the machine, and he calls it pulling levers and things and that's what free will would have to be. And he thinks, well, there's no ghost in the machine, so there's no free will. But you don't have to think of the mind or consciousness like that, like it's this supernatural thing. So Ayn Rand rejects the idea that the only way to think about cause and effect is it's one antecedent thing leading to something that necessitates something else, and there's just one long chain. That she thinks of cause and effect as you have an entity, a thing like a glass, that can act in a certain way, and if I drop it, I'm not going to do it, but if I drop it, it would shatter.
Right.
And she thinks of cause and effect as simultaneous. It's a glass hitting the ground that shatters because it's a glass. And she thinks for human beings, the power of choice means we as a thing have this power to select between these actions, or we have the action of selecting between these things. And that's a completely causal, natural process. So it's compatible with science. You don't need a ghost to try to explain this, but Pinker thinks you need a ghost.
One way of thinking about this is that it's not the case that free will is the power of some kind of ghostly soul, that the soul can leave the body and come back into you or something like that. In point of fact, It's a power, if what it is the power to choose to think or not, then it's a capacity of your consciousness, which means you've got to have a healthy functioning brain for that capacity to actually even come online in the first place. So you go to sleep or you die, there's no more choices left to be made. And even short of that, there are people who unfortunately get sick, or they have some kind of organic brain dysfunction. And at a certain point, you can't hold them responsible for their actions anymore, because they've in effect become deterministic pawns of whichever brain dysfunction they're suffering from. But Rand's idea is that if you've got a healthy brain, it's working on all throttles, then you can now direct it either way you want.
So there is no way that we could say that some people are more genetically inclined to evade reality, and some people are more genetically inclined to say, I will be more open to what reality has to teach me and, absorb rationality. There's no way. At the end, it's a choice. And why is it that we see that the majority of human beings, it seems to me that the majority of people are afraid of getting to their own conclusions. They are more comfortable in following whatever path is already established as the norm, whether it be a political ideology. If socialism is what's in fashion, I'm gonna be a socialist. If Catholicism is what it's the majority in Latin America, then I'm a Catholic. But if I were born in Thailand, I'm a Buddhist. Why do you think, if we as human beings and individuals have this amazing capacity to absorb reality as it is, using our senses, getting to our own conclusions, if we all have that ability, why is it that when you observe humanity as the majority, like if you would observe ants, right, in a colony, you would see humanity always in that it's only the minority choosing to use this amazing faculty, which is reason. Why do you think?
Good question. I
don't know if there's an answer, but now that we are talking about philosophy and everything.
I think there's things to say about it. Part of my perspective on it is that's too negative towards people.
Right.
So it's there's a difference between being able to, or choosing to think about something and being able to figure out the issues. And then you have to think what their environment and what their educational system is pushing them to do. But if you think of sort of the criticism that socialists and collectivists make is the free enterprise capitalism can't work because people can't look after their own lives. They're too stupid. They won't think for themselves. They won't figure out how to save their money, how to get a job. And that's not true.
Yeah.
And what the experience of America and of the West and a freer country shows is that when people have freedom, they do think about their lives and they do make better decisions and they can make rational decisions. And you don't see in terms of people's employment or something like that, their careers, that it's all just they're following what everybody else is doing and they're like sheep or ants. That's not how you see it. But you do see it like that in religion. I agree with that completely. That the majority of people who are Catholic, it's because they were in a Catholic environment, their parents were.
Right.
And there's an element, I think, they're not choosing to think about these issues. But on the other hand, these issues are really hard to think about.
Yeah.
They're hard to figure out. Is there a reason to think there is a God or not? That's a deep philosophical question. And people aren't encouraged to explore that. They're not encouraged to ask that kind of question. And they're not given the tools to how to grapple with this kind of question. So that you see a lot of people at these more difficult areas sort of just conforming to what other people say. Part of it is they don't know how to think about this, how to grapple with this. And the more you had a free nation and a free educational system that's pushing people, it's better to think about these things than go with the crowd. The more you would see that.
Yeah.
Also, the more that prominent cultural figures on either the religious side of things or the secular side of things, the more they talk about how people don't have free will, the more of a rationalization people are able to give for the fact that they're not choosing to think for themselves. and the system perpetuates itself.
Right.
I wanted to add one more thing, which is that, I mean, originally you had asked a question about, well, why could it be that there's a predisposition for certain people to think and a predisposition for other people to evade? And I just wanted to underscore that I think it's really important for defending the values of science and reason that that's not the case. I mean,
Right.
think from what would be true if there were certain people who, no matter what evidence you presented to them, they would never be able to look at it.
Right.
Well, it would mean that scientific reasoning is a privilege of those who are forced to think by their genetics.
Right.
Religious thinking is a privilege of those who are forced to not think by their genetics. What are the scientists then doing? Why do they think they're so special that they've figured out how to access the truth?
Right.
They're just the ones who've gotten the genetic luck of the draw. Typically, the way scientists think about this is to say, no, there's actually a proper method of using your mind, doing experiments, doing research, and we ought to use that method. We ought to choose to exercise our minds in a certain way to figure out the truth. And that's why I think they're correct when they say people who are blinding themselves and not looking at the scientific data are making a mistake. It's not that they had to do that, it's that they're choosing not to do that. So there's a really important sense in which the idea of free will, especially as Rand understands it, as the choice to use your mind or not, is a central and crucial presupposition of the whole idea of scientific rationality and objectivity. And that's once you, I think, fully grasp that fact, you have to realize that the arguments that are given against free will, allegedly on the basis of scientific observations, they're undercutting themselves because they undercut the whole possibility.
Now, what you both were
Objectivity.
saying made me think of a way of exemplifying this with two siblings, Dagny Taggart and James Taggart.
This is a great example.
Right? Because environmentally wise, they're both brought in the same family. Mm-hmm. They are exposed to hard work and entrepreneurship, but then the choices that they make and the character that they have, when Ayn Rand is describing them as children, they're completely different, right? Yeah. Dagny is developing honesty, she's developing courage, whereas James is always more timid and dishonest. So maybe this is so hard for people to grasp, because you can say, okay, here is Dagny growing up and here is James growing up, but there comes a point, where do we draw the line where Dagny will be Dagny forever and James will be James forever, and he cannot have an awakening moment when he's 55 where he starts being more like Dagny because he has stuck up his life with all these bad decisions, that there's no way that then he can magically have the personality or the character or the traces that it took Dagny or all her life to have, right? Can people change?
But those are two different things. So,
okay.
And it was relevant that you put it, can he magically do this and become?
Yeah,
no,
exactly.
he can't magically.
He can't magically, no.
But,
rationally?
Yes,
okay.
But over time, and it may be that if he's 75 years old, he just doesn't have the time to get to the level that Dagny got to.
Right.
But I think everyone retains the power of choice. Absent they've gone into a coma or a psychotic, they have a power of choice in the moment. And James Taggart in Atlas Shrugged could say, okay, I'm stopping to evade everything. I'm going to start to try to face the facts, try to face reality, try to face the real circumstances of my life. It will be really, really difficult for him to do that. And he'll have all kinds of, because of what he's done to himself and what he's stored in his mind, he'll have all kinds of temptations to say, this is too difficult, this is not worth it, what's the point of this? And to evade and to go back to what he was. So I think it's very hard, and that's why it's not anywhere close to magic, for him to put himself on a better trajectory. And the same for Dagny on the reverse side, that if Dagny started to say, like, well, this is, I spend 16 hours a day in the office, and what for? And maybe I should just go home and leave at 8 hours and start to coast, and I'm not going to really, who cares about the problems on the railroad? And then do what James starts to do, is there's not really problems, nobody could help it, it's just a natural disaster. And she could start not facing reality. And over time, that would have a really bad effect on her personality, her character, her moral nature. But that's different than it being magic.
Right.
I think this is a really great example, and I often use it to talk about this issue. And one of the things that Onkar said about why, for James, he could still start to make different choices late in life, but it would be really difficult. I think what that kind of point shows is what it means to form character. That there's an idea of character that's kind of an enduring set of dispositions. That's something that you make part of yourself, even though you have the power to start to make it in a different way. And that's especially important when it's the idea that Ayn Rand called the idea of a self-made soul. Onkar has a great essay about this in the companion to Ayn Rand. But it's important when you start to think about some of these ideas that get tossed around in our culture today. You didn't build that. Now, Obama, when he said that, he was talking about roads and bridges. But there are philosophers who will sort of take that idea and run with it, and they'll say, you didn't build your soul. You didn't build your character. The fact that you have a good work ethic, you think that means you're entitled to the fruits of your labor. But since your character really just comes from accidents of your genetics and your environment, you can't take credit for it. And so we should redistribute the wealth. But it's important that, Dagny's work ethic, she didn't magically will it into existence at any given moment. That's true. But she built it up over years of making rational choices, even though she started from the same place as James. And so, when people say, well, Dagny, people like Dagny, they start with certain advantages, inherited wealth, even probably some degree of intelligence. They didn't choose to have those advantages to begin with. Someone gave it to them. That's true. Yeah. But what the Dagny and James example shows is that justice is about what you do with what you're given, right? Dagny does great things with what she's given. James doesn't. Dagny deserves the results of her work, and James doesn't have any work to do to deserve the results of it.
Yeah, when I give conferences to unprivileged young people in Latin America, and I mean unprivileged not because, there's no access to education and things like this, because of the system that it's imposed. It's not because naturally it's like this. I tell them, listen guys, I think that no matter our differences in life, because we're all different, but there are, regarding our choices and the way we want to live, there are basically 4 types of humans: adders, multipliers, subtractors, and dividers. And multipliers and dividers are on the side that they're born with, a good position, right? Maybe a family that has a good enterprise, they have access to education, they've been loved, they've been well educated. But the multipliers multiply and leave this world better than they find it. The dividers, like James Taggart, even though they have, this nurturing environment, they divide what they got since the beginning, and by the end of their lives, they don't give to the world more than they received. Now, on the other hand, you can be born in a pretty harsh environment, maybe a favela, you didn't have access to education, your parents, couldn't afford it, and you're poor. But still you have a choice, right? You can add more value to the little that it was given to you, or you can subtract it by becoming a gangster or a drug dealer or kill people, or, even though the choice is yours, wherever and maybe this is a simplistic way of putting it, but it's a way that I try to explain to people, no matter where you're born, you still have the choice. Now, we established that definitely we're not born knowing things. So I want to ask, in the case of both of you, and with this we end the interview, because unfortunately we don't have more time, but I wanted to ask you, what was your process into, using your free will until reaching philosophy of objectivism, and how it has transformed your lives?
Well, it's interesting because I think part of the reason I'm interested in this topic of free will and in objectivism, because it focuses so much on it, is because I'm a person who changed his mind about some really big things at various points in my life. So, for example, I was raised in a pretty religious family, and I was myself pretty religious for a while. And at a certain point, though, I started to ask certain kinds of questions, make certain kinds of observations, started to doubt it, and completely rejected my religious views. And now I'm an atheist. Likewise with politics, I started out on the left, while I was religious, interestingly.
Wow, my God.
And started to see problems with it too. And now I'm, an advocate of individual rights.
How long did it take you?
Oh, it was within this, and that's, I think, also interesting because it was within the same span of about 2 years. And so, I feel like I've made some big choices that have had big impacts on my life. Mm-hmm. I feel like this is, I've got pretty good data for that, and I'm interested in understanding that philosophically. I also made career choice changes in the same kind of way.
Yeah? From what to what?
Well, I was originally going to be a diplomat.
Cool.
Actually, and then I discovered when I started debating with people about philosophy, I wasn't very diplomatic, and I was much more interested in trying to figure out what's actually true, not what will make various parties compromise, and that's how I got into philosophy. And it was around the same time that I was exploring different philosophies, and found Objectivism, and that was the one that made the most sense of this very process that I had just been going through.
Yeah, I relate to you because I studied international affairs and I was very direct in the beginning of my career. And they were like, maybe you chose the wrong career. You don't have these diplomatic talents.
That's exactly what it was.
But I believe that actually accurate diplomacy, it's talking things, as they should be, instead of like sugarcoating or being completely rude when you talk, right? So
in a better world, that's the way diplomacy would.
Yeah, exactly, proper diplomacy. But maybe that you can be a good ambassador of Objectivism in audiences like ours now that haven't heard about this philosophy and need, this bridging that Alex Epstein talks about, right? Like, how can we bridge what Objectivism has to offer? How about you, Onkar?
So I got it much less political and much more a kind of moral, ethical focus. So I used to divide up. I mean, I didn't know that this is my classification, but I knew I used to divide people up into categories in the way that most people didn't. And one reflection was the friends I had in school. So I was at the top of my class. It wasn't a very good class, so it doesn't say that much. But I was at the top of my class. But I was not friends with just other kids who were near the top of the class. I had some like that, some that were way low in the class, and it didn't matter. What mattered to me was, did I think this person was a thinker,
right,
or not? But I didn't know
of the brain.
Yeah, and I didn't know that that's how I'm classed. But so when I read Atlas Shrugged, and it was your basic choice is to think or not.
Yes.
I got that. That's how I look at people. This is how I class. And I think if you're making the choice to think, I don't care how smart you are, what grades you're getting. And if you're, as you're saying, if you weren't from a great family and you don't have a lot of books around, you might not be a reader, and so that didn't matter to me at all. All that mattered to me was, are you a person who puts in that fundamental effort, or are you not? And the theory, Ayn Rand's theory of free will, so not just that we have free will, but it's about a choice to think or not. That made a huge impact on me, and it clarified, I'm right to be looking at the world like this. And this is what it means even more to look at the world like this in those terms, and to think of justice, as Ben was talking about, in those terms, and to think of all morality in those terms. And so I'm really passionate about getting the right view of free will out there.
Right.
Because I think it would make a tremendous positive difference if people thought of themselves as, and thought of other people as, they have this fundamental choice to think or not.
Onkar, Ben, thank you very much for sitting down here and talking to us. And one last thing for our audience, where to start? Because I know that this series is going to be watched by people who maybe they have doubted their religion, their political views, how they evaluate who is their friend, who is not, but they have not encountered Objectivism for different reasons. So where to start? What would you recommend for people who are questioning themselves and trying to find, a better philosophy into which live their lives?
I mean, one of the things I always recommend is the novels of Ayn Rand, and either the Fountainhead or Atlas. And I think they appeal to different people, particularly as this is the first book you're going to read. Atlas is 1,000+ pages, so it's long. It's grand scale about a whole society.
Yeah.
There's lots of characters. The Fountainhead is a much more intimate story. It's the story of Howard Rourke, an architect, his life, what it looks like to succeed at a very personal level. And you have, if that is that resonates much more with me, take the Fountainhead. And if this kind of grand scale portrait of a whole society and
Yeah.
the interactions of that enforce then reality.
That's where I started. Maybe it's because of the diplomat mentality. I'm thinking of
Yeah,
different
yeah,
nations. What about you?
I would
Ben?
just add that, I think that Atlas Shrugged, there's an important dimension of that whole story, which is about free will. I'm actually giving a talk at this conference on that very issue. But I agree that's the first place somebody should start. But if they're interested in following up, learning more about just the kind of the nonfiction technical philosophy end, Dr. Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, is a really important systematic presentation of the philosophy. And if they want to learn more about the issue of free will, they should probably, there's a really good short talk that Onkar did that's on YouTube. I think it's called Free Will versus Science.
Cool.
That's Dave Rubin, I think.
Well, there's a Dave Rubin one, and then there's one, Seizing the Reins of Your Mind.
Right.
And that probably gives references to a number of other sources on the issue of free will.
Well, thank you very much for sitting down here and talking to us. I hope that with this, more people that are looking for answers can find them here. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Onkar. And to you guys, stay tuned because we're coming with more of this series to understand objectivism from different perspectives.